He had made a fortune by seeing what others missed. Markets moved in fractions. Deals were closed on the backs of spreadsheets and instincts. Rafael Mendes had learned to read a line of numbers like a human heartbeat. He had never expected, at 52, that the single most shocking thing he would ever read or see would be the small, filthy hand of a child in the service yard behind his own house. The house itself was a lesson in control. Glass and stone assembled into geometric certainty, marble floors that reflected afternoon light like a calm pond, rooms that felt designed to keep sound at bay. A staff of people moved through its corridors with the hush of a museum. There were contracts that named the cook, the chauffeur, the gardener. There were inventories for the wine cellar and the art. There were, as far as Rafael knew, plans for every contingency, except for the one that confronted him that morning. He had flown back ahead of schedule. A meeting was cancelled in the middle of the night. A board needed him by phone. He slept badly on the plane and decided, on impulse, to come home early. The staff had been told, in a way they recognized. He wanted the house to feel as if he belonged to it again, at least for a day. He walked through it unannounced, his keys swinging, looking for familiar marks, the loose tile in the library, the small scuff at eye height on the banister where his wrist had hit it years ago. The hush of servants, the polished surfaces, the silence of the rooms where he had once tried to make peace with being everywhere and nowhere at once. He found her not in the house, but where the house met the world's refuse. A narrow service yard lined with bins and recycling cages, a space that smelled faintly of fermenting peelings and old coffee. The staff entrance led here, and beyond it the alley and the street. A little girl crouched beside a grey plastic bin, her dress muddied, her hair knotted at the back in a careless braid. She had a small face. She was no older than 7. Rafael knew the face before he knew the name. An adoption photograph he had kept in his wallet for a year after she came home. He had not been here to break the first week of her life open for him because of meetings and flights and the habit of distance he had earned. That photograph flitted into focus and then was eclipsed by the reality of a child digging for scraps. She lifted one hand from the bin and clutched something between her fingers, a soggy piece of bread wrapped in a paper napkin. Her fingers trembled. She was filthy. The hem of her dress was caked with ground. Her knees had dark smudges. The most immediate detail was not a bruise or a wound, but the hollowness of her cheeks, the way her collarbones pronounced themselves under thin skin. When she heard his steps, she froze, as if the air itself had become dangerous. "Papa," she said, the single word an implosion of hope and terror. It was the name he had chosen before he learned how to be one. In an instant, all the distances he had accumulated, the flights, the boardrooms, the speeches, collapsed into a single, unbearable proximity. She did not run to him. She did not smile. She pressed the bread closer to her chest, as if that small scrap were a talisman. Her eyes were wide, dark pools that did not reach the corners. For a moment Rafael could do nothing but look at the way a child's thing could be broken, how absence could rearrange a young body. There was a reflex of fury, blunt and immediate, that rose and nearly spilled from him. He heard his voice, rough with flight and late sleep, say her name. She did not move. Behind them, a door opened, and a woman in a suit stepped out. Veronica Aguiar, his wife by paperwork, and the woman who had first welcomed Sophia into the house with staged tenderness months earlier. In public she gave speeches about children, sat at carefully photographed fundraisers, posed with smiles that had been vetted by PR teams. Today, in the doorway, she had the polished, shocked look of someone performing a mother's discovery. "Oh, my goodness," she said, hands rising like a curtain. "What are you doing out here, Sophia? Come, we'll get you cleaned up." Sophia crouched closer to the bin, as if to make herself invisible. When Veronica reached for her, the child flinched and pressed the paper napkin to her chest like a shield. She did not respond to the public script. Rafael stepped forward and took the child into his arms before anyone could supply an explanation. Her body was light in his hands, as if it were nothing at all and too heavy at the same time. He inhaled the smell of dust and old bread, and the iron tang of something that suggested neglect more than malice, but the two can act as accomplices. He felt blood in his ears. Veronica's voice echoed across the yard, small and pitched, a rehearsed note meant for cameras that were not there. "This is impossible," she said. "I would never—" Her denial was immediate and theatrical. She looked toward the staff door, then at the child in his arms, then back to Rafael, as though to find the cue that he should play along. She put on the mother's hand for the cameras he knew she imagined, but Sophia's body was a portrait of distrust. She did not warm to the hand, did not soften. When Rafael asked in a low voice what had happened, Sophia closed her eyes and said, barely audible, "They said I could go if I didn't bother anyone." That sentence later sat like a splinter in Rafael's memory, plural, unnamed, a voice that had power over her possibilities. She was an adopted daughter. The language of abandonment had found new ways to be cruel. She whispered, "If I make trouble, they'll send me back." It was the particular terror of adopted children, to be unwanted twice. He took her inside. The household staff, who had probably seen bits of the scene from behind curtains and pantries for years, moved with a briskness that had been taught and a silence that had been demanded. A tray appeared, warm water, a towel, a sweater large enough to bulb around the child. She allowed the towel to be placed around her and sat stilled on the couch, as if the warmth might betray her. Her small hands were calloused in strange ways. There were dark marks under one sleeve, as if small bruises had been a regular punctuation. "I want the doctor," Rafael said to no one in particular. The word felt like a command. He had the authority to give. He had the means to make the house a safe zone on the spot, and yet the most urgent violence had already happened. Trust had been pulverized. That was the first promise he made to himself, unspoken, and then later said aloud, "Never again." Early CTA, if this is hitting you, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. The initial assessment in the house was quick and clinical. Dr. Beatrice arrived with a quiet severity. A pediatrician with years spent in both private practice and clinics, where the real world taught her the language of hunger in children's bodies. She made notes that Rafael pretended not to be able to read, though he read everything like a market report now. She checked Sophia's vitals with firm fingers. The scales had not been used on the child in months, she said, and she asked permission to take her to the clinic for tests. Veronica protested softly, a prelude of the performance that would become her defense. But when Rafael signed 3 forms, Veronica's tone shifted to one of wounded compliance. At the hospital, Dr. Beatrice did what she had always done. She translated body into report. Sophia's weight was below the 5th percentile for a girl her age. There were old bruises in different stages of healing on her arms, and a faint scar near one elbow that suggested repeated catching, the kind of marks that are less dramatic than they are telling. On a shelf, a small plastic box held a shoebox that had become Sophia's cache. When the child was distracted later with juice and crackers, Jorge, the head of security, who had quietly arrived just as he had to every foreign place Rafael's life required, opened the shoebox and found wrapped bits of food, a small folded paper with a drawing of a house and a jagged line down the middle, a toy with missing paint, and a matchbox-sized note with the word "back" written in a child's uneven scrawl. "It's like her small things were confiscated sooner," Jorge muttered. "People don't hide food unless someone took it away." Dr. Patricia, the social worker assigned by the clinic, sat on the edge of a chair, like someone who had seen too many tiny lives rest against her own caution. She spoke gently to Sophia, who answered in half-sentences and drawings. The drawings were worth more than 100 questions, a home coloured in grey, a son that had a face that looked worried, a small stick figure labelled "me" outside a tall figure under a roof with barred windows. The language of small hands is blunt and unsparing when there are no adults to translate. "We need to document everything," Dr. Patricia said. "Photos, measurements, all interviews with staff. If we're looking at neglect, chain of custody matters." It was not a sentence addressed to Rafael only. It was a doctrine of the system that often steps in where families fail. Rafael sat in a white plastic chair in a corridor and felt at once the keening sting of guilt and the metallic heat of responsibility. He had been absent in ways that numbers and advisors had made palatable. He had spent money, enough to buy schools and hospitals, on the assumption that the purchase of time and comfort would substitute for him. Now every one of those transactions looked like a lie. He had entrusted the life of a child to a woman who made speeches praising maternal care, and the thing he most feared, that his absence would create a vacancy that cruelty could move into, had happened. Veronica arrived at the clinic as well, late and composed. She had done television interviews where she discussed children's literacy and international aid. In the 2 minutes she stood under the clinic's fluorescent lights before she knew details, she gave a performance. Soft hand on the child's shoulder, a smile that suggested shock, and the strategic lament of someone who had had only one episode of surprise that morning. How could this happen? No one told me. When Dr. Beatriz presented the preliminary findings, the room changed color. "Severe acute malnutrition is a strong term," she said. "We can see neglect on the body and behavior consistent with fear responses. There are signs of repeated isolation. We'll run blood work, and we'll need a full psychosocial evaluation." She explained in short sentences what the data could mean not to a shareholder meeting, but to a human being whose life had been reoriented by this single child. Rafael listened. Each clinical item became a ledger entry in his heart. The question that throbbed, simple and raw, was why. Why had the woman who professed love staged harm instead? Why had the staff not flagged this earlier? Rafael's mind went through the mechanics of the house, access, duties, rotations. It also went through the public mechanics that had allowed Veronica's persona to be unassailable. Press, donors, the careful curation of every smile. He called Jorge and asked him to prepare a list of every camera on the property and to make copies of all relevant footage, with timestamps. Jorge was ex-police. He understood the need for a rigid record. "I'll secure it, sir," he said. "We'll get the backups from the server room. If anything was deleted, I can tell from the logs. We'll have to work fast." "You must do it legally," Rafael added before he could second-guess himself. The adjective was both a practical instruction and a moral trimming to his instincts. He had money. He had the temptation to bulldoze through protocols. He kept reminding himself that legitimacy mattered now more than ever. The house would be safe, but the courtroom, if it came to that, would require that everything had been gathered by the book. Juliana came the next day. She was Sophia's teacher at the private school across town, a woman who had once made a career of classroom management and now had the tired, patient face of someone who had grown to see the complexities of families in her students' backpacks. When she stepped into the house, she brought with her a folder of small things. Daily notes that had been written for parents, teachers' remarks, art projects that had been kept in a neat pile. Juliana's handwriting was the map of a child's life in the harmless medium of schoolwork. "I noticed weight loss," she said simply, looking at a drawing Sophia had done in early autumn. "She stopped eating in class. She said she was too full. Then later she wouldn't eat at all. She used to bring snacks from home, then stopped. I thought it might be a family issue, maybe diet changes. I asked once and she said not to worry. Kids shut down in different ways." Her voice did not have accusation in it. It had the regret of a teacher who had trusted routines to protect a child and been wrong. In Sophia's backpack there were also notes from home, signed forms that Veronica had co-signed in a hand that Rafael now recognized as practiced. They were the veneer of parenthood, permission slips, receipts, a photograph with a smiling mother. It was the paperwork of normalcy. It was, Rafael realized with a tightening jaw, the sort of documentation that can be used both to prove care and to conceal it. Back at the house, Jorge walked Rafael through a map of the security system. "We have a dozen internal cameras, sir," he said. "Service yard, pantry, corridor by the staff quarters. Footage goes to a local server. They keep daily backups overnight. Someone can delete things, but if they only did so from the console, the logs would show it. If they remove drives, that's messier but still traceable." Jorge's face, weathered with experience, gave Rafael the small comfort of expertise. "We'll archive everything," Jorge said, "and we'll put a hold on staff rotations so we know who was where and when." He paused. "If we'll be moving forward legally, we should make sure the chain of custody is unbroken. I'll secure a documented copy of every file, and we'll have a forensics company image the drives. We don't want the defense saying we tampered." The word defense lodged like a pebble in Rafael's throat. He had to imagine a trial now, a theater in which the one thing he had vowed, to keep his daughter safe, would be interrogated. There was also the other theater he had seen played on screens, the polished public relations moves of Veronica's team. He could imagine her giving an interview in silk and pearls, a slight tremor of emotion professionally timed. He could imagine people sympathizing with the mother performing in the spotlight. That was the danger of privilege, dressed as virtue. It could be used as armor. But the house contained evidence that refused to be staged away. In a small cloth drawer in the kitchen, Jorge found a key labeled "Pantry," staff only. It was one of many keys. Houses like this run on keys. The key did not prove guilt. It proved opportunity. The pantry itself had been measured and photographed, and Dr. Beatrice noted in a report that would later be subpoenaed that there were locks on certain cabinets and that the girl's access to food appeared to have been restricted. When confronted with these photographs, Veronica's initial retort was to act wounded and then to suggest, in the careful hedging of someone who had rehearsed legal distance, that she had been the one to restrict access in an attempt to teach discipline. "We are a structured household," she said in one early statement. "We maintain rules. Rules can be a cover for neglect. Rules can be a pretext for control." Rafael watched the child in small, private ways. He learned the way she folded her hands when scared, and the way she hummed a tune that seemed to be a whisper of the same melody she had hummed when she was first brought home. He learned that she loved the taste of oranges, and that she could string those small brown beads she had found into a bracelet with surprising dexterity. He also learned that certain words caused her to look away. "Teacher," she would say, and then be quiet. Bedtime pulled her into the safe ritual of teeth-brushing and story. Leave made her edge toward the door. The psychologist, Dr. Renata, met Sophia in a room filled with toys that looked more like props than normal life. She did not ask the child to narrate. She watched. "Children tell you the most by what they do not say," she told Rafael afterward. Sophia avoided the corners of the room and always kept one toy in her lap by way of assurance. She flinched when Veronica's name was mentioned. When asked to draw her family, she drew herself small and far from the other figures and colored a window like an outline, then shaded inside with dark strokes. Dr. Renata exchanged a look with Dr. Beatrice that bothered Rafael more than any clinical explanation. "You can see a pattern of learned helplessness," the psychologist said, in a voice designed not to scold. "It's not just about hunger. It's about an environment that teaches a child they have no agency. That's very corrosive." There were other pieces. Bank statements showed that Veronica had made purchases of baby formula, then returned them, the records indicated, and there were suspicious entries for consumables that did not match the inventory on the kitchen list. House staff, at first reluctant, began to speak in fragments when Rafael made it clear he would hear them without punishment. The maid who said she had once emptied Sophia's small plate and been told by Veronica that the child was on a special schedule. The driver who remembered a night when he saw Sophia on the back stairs with a blanket, but did not report it. Fear had consolidated their silence. Fear of losing their jobs. Fear of being dragged into a fight with someone powerful and litigious. "You protected yourself," Jorge told Rafael, when one of the cook's hands trembled as she recounted turning away from a starving child because the mistress said not to interfere. The sentence had a double edge, a condemnation and a recognition that within house hierarchies, human beings make small accommodations to survive. Rafael felt himself becoming methodical. He hired Enrique Cardoso, a lawyer known for family law and an appetite for complex, high-stake cases that required both surgical legal moves and discretion. Enrique sat in Rafael's study and listened without note-taking for the first 10 minutes, an old habit, and then asked precisely the sort of questions Rafael needed to answer. "What did you know? What did you do when you learned? What is your objective?" "To protect my daughter," Rafael said. The answer felt like an anchor. "And to protect yourself?" Enrique asked, not unkindly. "In court, there are no pure motives. There are only facts and intentions sifted through testimony." Enrique's point was practical. The more transparently Rafael acted from the perspective of the child's interest, the less the case smelled of personal vendetta. Enrique recommended a twofold approach: secure evidence and secure the child. He suggested filing for emergency guardianship to ensure Sophia's immediate safety in a court he trusted would not be swayed by PR. He also advised against public statements. "Silence is your asset," he said. "Let the evidence speak. She will try to weaponize sympathy. We do not give her an opening." Veronica's first move, predictably, came before any filings. She issued a press statement that read like a script. Shocked, humbly distressed, grief-struck. She appeared on local morning shows days later, composed and radiant in a way that made people instinctively offer sympathy. She spoke about miscommunication and staff failures, and her voice wove in the right phrases. Motherly instinct, a lapse, devastating. She was careful not to mention the word neglect. She presented herself as the injured party now, the woman whose public service was being questioned. Rafael watched the interviews and felt the old twitch of old instincts. To counterpunch, to use his wealth to smother the story with his own narrative. Enrique stopped that reflex with a single look. "No press," he said. "Keep your statements to the court and the child. Public spats will help her." But the world had its own momentum. The story leaked in bits. A photograph of a child in a messy dress. People picked sides. Veronica's supporters rallied, offering her the kind of cover privilege means. Donors who took her calls, journalists who accepted her narrative because it was familiar and pretty. Rafael learned quickly that the public eye loved clear villains and clearer victims. He had slipped into the shadows between those categories. Rich man and father, both sympathetic and suspect. Then Jorge called him at midnight. "We had a look at the server," he said, voice like gravel. "There were deletions. Someone removed footage from the pantry camera. The logs show an account used at 2 in the morning last month after the guests left. It's odd." Rafael set the phone down and stared at the ceiling, suddenly very small under the swoop of his luxury home. Someone had known the cameras and the timing. Someone had known how to hide. The knowledge that the house was designed to keep secrets made Rafael feel both foolish and furious. "Can you recover it?" he asked. "We can recover parts," Jorge said. "But some files were overwritten. There's a fragment with audio and a still frame. It looks like someone..." I think Veronica ordered the child into a room and then something else happens that you should see. It's damaged, though. We'll bring in a forensic imaging team in the morning. A fragment was nothing and everything. A frame that could be played in court was a dagger of proof. A corrupted file was a promise of what might be salvageable. Henrique, when told, said the same practical thing he always did: secure the chain of custody, document the deletion logs, and get sworn statements from staff. He explained to Rafael, in the kind of plain language Rafael preferred, that showing a deletion and then connecting it to a motive was an argument they could carry into court to prove consciousness of guilt. But consciousness of guilt is not the same as conviction. It is instead a legal inference. Henrique wanted to build an immutable line, a medical report, sworn testimony from staff, the teacher's notes, the psychologist's assessment, and footage. The damaged file was the hinge. Rafael spent the night with Sophia on a sofa in the library, her legs folded against him like a child who had just learned a new, strange basic, that an adult could stay. He woke to the sound of morning and the faint synthetic chirp of reminder notifications he had turned off for years. In the daylight, with the child breathing slow and safe beside him, he let himself wonder at his own life and the smallness of its focus. Money had permitted a sort of distance he had mistaken for freedom. Now his freedom would be redefined as presence and stamina. Sophia woke and reached for a sketchbook. She drew a sun that shimmered and a house with an open door. Rafael watched and felt, for the first time in a public life lived in stages, that he had to be someone else, a father who could be patient. The small rituals began. Toast with marmalade she liked, a bedtime story read out of awkward devotion, slow walks in the private garden where he paid attention to her small hand in his. Yet the house was still a theater of secrets. That week Jorge presented a trove of documents that felt like puzzle pieces. Employee schedules, delivery logs, a keycard record showing who had been in the pantry on particular nights. There were also recorded calls between Veronica's assistant and a PR consultant discussing possible narratives if a personal issue were to surface. The assistant's voice, hesitant and thin, was not a smoking gun, but a thread. Then came a small, almost flippant discovery that struck Rafael hardest. A list of donations in Veronica's foundation, many of them large and public, and then a set of private transactions to an account that, when traced, suggested lavish payments, not to charities, but to one of the household's staff members' families. Gifts can be acts of kindness. They can also be bribes or insurance against silence. Rafael's stomach turned. He imagined envelopes slid under tables and the pressure on someone to keep quiet. The tipping point came when Juliana, the teacher, handed over a notebook Sophia had once used at school. Tucked between the pages was a short letter written in a shaky adult hand, not Veronica's, but the handwriting of a housekeeper who had worked here 6 years and who had recently left under mutual terms. The letter, addressed "To whom it may concern," spoke of a system in the house, punishment for small citizenships like spilling a drink, rewards withheld as discipline, silence bought with favors. It was not dramatic. It read like a catalogue of small cruelties. It mentioned a room where Sophia had been sent for hours for thinking too much. The housekeeper had kept it in the pocket of the notebook because, she said when she handed it over, she was afraid of what would happen if she kept it at home. Rafael felt both vindicated and ashamed. The house had been a place for small corruptions, not necessarily dramatic violence, but the compound effect was the same. Each small withholding had been a cut. He called Veronica to confront her directly. She answered, voice measured. He described what he had found in clinical terms, and then, when he could not keep the rawness from his tone, he told her that the child had been found in the trash. The image of her body sifting through refuse was too clean to be symbolic. It was the human translation of negligence. Veronica listened. Her replies were a studied montage of incredulity and then placation. "I would never allow that," she said at one point, and Rafael felt the room constrict around a single unyielding fact. She had rehearsed this phrase for 1,000,000 audiences. Her anger came out not as confession, but as accusation. "You weren't here to see the difficulties. You never are. You leave everything to me, and then you come back and say this." Now she spoke of his absences as if they were the greater crime. There is a cruelty in blaming the absent for the present. It is a way to invert responsibility and to paint the truth as a peccant grievance. His absence had been real, but it had not made him innocent of the consequence. He heard the words of the housekeeper's letter, of Juliana's notes, of the doctor and the psychologist, and he understood that guilt could be both a public and private ledger. "You will not manipulate her for the cameras," Rafael told her finally. His voice was flat and new. "You will cooperate with the doctors and the staff. You will not speak to the press." Her eyes hardened. "Or what?" she asked. The question was both a challenge and a trap. "I will do what is necessary to protect my daughter," he said. It was no longer a private promise. It would become, in time, a public obligation. Enrique would later tell him that these were good words to think about, but not necessarily words to say in public because people love drama. For the moment, though, Rafael needed to make clear to the woman who had been entrusted with a child's life that he would not be cajoled. The house did not fall quiet after that. It settled into a new, taut rhythm, interviews, inventories, little interrogations that were held with calm faces. The staff began to move with the tension of small animals in a net. Some offered to speak, others retreated. Jorge arranged for the proper imaging of servers and hard drives and brought in an outside forensics team to create bit-for-bit copies of the surveillance system. That night when the forensics team worked, Rafael sat in his study and watched a single still from the pantry camera replayed on a screen. A blurred silhouette of a woman guiding a small child by the arm, a door closing. The image was grainy, a shadow of motion, but the small body of the child was visible in an unmistakable slant. "There's audio here too," Jorge said, "but some of it is garbled. The file's been partially overwritten. We can try to enhance it." Rafael cupped his face in his hands. He wanted a cinematic proof, a piece of evidence that would cut through the fog of public opinion. A clip in which the words were clear and the act undeniable. He knew that if he unloaded everything he had and launched the shot directly into the press, he would be accused of spectacle. Enrique had warned him that Veronica's team would manufacture a counter-narrative, and they would be shrewd. But the sight of his daughter in the trash had already been a spectacle. He could no longer pretend the world had not seen the truth. In the middle of the night, Sophia came to him and curled under his arm, as if she had always known that solace was a thing that could be kept. He told her about oranges and walks and the small rituals that would be her anchor. She listened. She cross-legged and drew a house with a wide-open door. "Here," she said, pointing to the gap in the picture. "We stay." He vowed to make that picture real. When morning arrived, Jorge held up a small stack of printouts. There were timestamps, keycard logs, an edited frame that, though damaged, suggested movement and intent. There was also a notation, an entry in the log showing a deletion of files at 2 a.m. a month earlier. A name was attached to the deletion, an administrative account with privileges tied to Veronica's assistant. The assistant, when interviewed, spoke of being told to clean up space on the server by an unnamed manager. She had not known whose instruction it was, she said, and this was the sort of human noise that suggests either complicity or fear. "You have to understand how this plays out," Enrique told him later. He was calm, economical, the man Rafael had hired because he was a surgeon of cases. "We want to establish a pattern, deprivation and concealment. show the child's condition, the restrictions on resources, the staff testimony, and then show that someone took steps to erase records. That's not the entire case, but it is a strong narrative for the judge. It demonstrates that whoever is responsible also took steps to hide it. Rafael listened and nodded, because he understood that those were the rules of the arena he had stepped into. He had built empires by understanding systems. Now he was trying to translate human cruelty into a board of exhibits. One night, alone in the study with a single lamp and the evidence files spread before him, he opened a small box of photographs he had kept from the first days of Sophia's life. There were pictures of a child with a clipped smile and big, trusting eyes. He had once used that image as a talisman against loneliness. He realized he had been using it to justify his absence, telling himself that financial provision equaled presence. The photos were thinner now. The gap between the man in suits and the child with a crushed sandwich in a bin felt like an entire life's worth of error. He had the means to shield her from what had occurred, to pay for the best doctors and the best lawyers. He had the means, in a less lyric way, to make sure the truth, whatever it cost him publicly, would be laid out. But means are not the same as will. He felt the will assembling itself, protect the child, document the case, prepare for war. He had to be ready not just for a trial, but for the subtler work afterward, the slow unlearning of fear in a child who had been taught not to take up space. There was one file left on the desktop that Jorge had flagged as the one to watch. "It's the pantry camera fragment," Jorge said when he finally brought it forward. "There's a second there, a deleted audio track with a woman's voice. We might be able to match it." Rafael opened the file. It stuttered like a heart with an arrhythmia, frames skipping and then returning with a blurred line of motion. He watched a hand close on a child's wrist. He heard, or thought he heard, a woman's voice, clipped and cruel. The sound was incomplete, a shattered sentence that suggested a command. For a moment he felt a clarity he had never wanted. Here was the moment where a life had been narrowed by another's authority. Then the image hiccuped and dissolved into static. Enrique leaned in, eyes narrowed. "If we can authenticate the frame and link the deletion to the account, we can ask for an emergency order," he said. "But the other side will claim tampering. They will try to turn this into a battle of experts." Rafael stared at the static. He thought of how he had measured risk in spreadsheets and how this had taught him a different metric, the moral calculus of a small body that trusted him. The sound of the evidentiary file was like an unfinished sentence. He could feel the courtroom's weight already, a thing he had tried to keep distant. He thought of Veronica appearing on morning shows and choosing words that would bind other people's sympathies to her. In that moment, he understood something in a way that had little to do with power or money. Protecting a child means sometimes stepping into ugliness and legalities and public scrutiny. It means choosing a path that may cause scandal. It means risking reputation for a truth that is messy by design. He closed the laptop and went to Sophia's room. It had been converted slowly and purposely from a place of small, clandestine rituals into a real child's space. There was a new lamp, a low bookshelf, and a small quilt with embroidered stars. Sophia was asleep, curled under the covers, with one hand outside, fingers in the light. Rafael stood over her for a long time and watched the even rise and fall of breath. He felt, in that place, the nascent knowledge of a man who had been given a second chance to be something other than a participant in the world he had built. There were tasks to be done, and people to be interviewed, and legal boxes to be checked. He would call Ricardo, Veronica's ex-husband, who, Jorge had discovered, had once filed a complaint about controlling behavior, and ask for what corroboration he could give. He would schedule a formal petition for protective custody. He would make sure the forensics team could recover every viable bite of evidence. He would ensure that the chain of custody for every photograph, every witness statement, every note was immaculate. But before all of that, he sat down and wrote, in a letter he would never send, a list of promises to the child asleep in the room. I will be present. I will not let you be invisible. I will not let anyone tell stories about you that are untrue. Those promises were private and public at the same time. In them he found the compass he had not known he was missing. The first part of the fight, he knew, would hinge on a fragment, a damaged file that might contain a single moment when a woman's voice ordered a child into isolation, when a key turned in a lock, when a child's attempts at reclamation were met with cruelty. It was not definitive. It was a hinge. Enrique and Jorge would shape it, technical teams and testimony would support it, and a judge would perhaps grant a measure of immediate protection based on the weight of the assembled evidence. Rafael slept little that week. He sat in depositions and in quiet rooms and listened to people speak of small things that, when placed together, made a mosaic of neglect. He learned the names of the pieces: withheld nourishment, isolation as punishment, staff fear. Each name was a nail in an uncertain case. Each nail also pounded painfully into the idea he had carried of himself. There would be storms of reputation. There would be storms of reputation. There would be people ready to pick apart a life that had been built to be impermeable. Journalists would call with soft, insinuating questions. Donors would ask awkwardly timed concerns. Friends who had long been courteous at dinner parties would suddenly need clarification. Enrique had warned him that public opinion was a weather system unto itself. Sometimes it broke over you in a single ruinous tide. Rafael braced for that, and privately for something harder, having to watch the life he had curated be used as proof that he had been absent long enough for harm to move in. Veronica's team moved like a machine already oiled by practice. Predictable press releases came first, careful and performative, then curated interviews in which she appeared composed and grief-stricken. Her speeches were polished shards designed to attract sympathy and dissuade curiosity. Enrique refused to respond in kind. He chose instead the slow, surgical approach of evidence first, words later. If we fight their cameras, we give them a theater, he told Rafael. We build a courtroom. So they built one. The evidence room filled with binders, the pediatric reports, the psychologist's notes, Juliana's teacher logs, the housekeeper's letter, the photographic chain of custody. Forensics produced hashes and metadata, and Jorge sat beside the technicians as if the computer screens were battle maps. They printed the keycard logs and had the forensics team attest to their integrity. Each item was labeled, photographed, and double-checked. They also prepared for the counterpunch. Enrique explained with patient candor how Veronica's camp would likely argue. They would say the child had always been safe, that the marks on her body were accidents, that the missing footage was merely a technical error. They would weaponize the father's absence. How could he not have known? And then use it to paint him as culpable through neglect of duty rather than an offended parent. They would try to confuse sympathy with responsibility. Rafael listened and learned the mechanics of truth in a legal arena. He practiced restraint in his answers and neutrality in public. He allowed Enrique to keep the narrative tight and factual, and he stopped speaking publicly beyond a single measured statement. His priority was the child's safety. That statement was short and unadorned, meant to puncture the spectacle rather than feed it. Inside the house, life narrowed to essentials. Alejandro, Rafael's chief operating officer, took over business continuity with a quiet competence. He promised to run meetings in Rafael's stead and to keep the company steady. Rafael did not apologize for stepping back. He could not afford half measures. He began to spend nights on the couch outside Sophia's door, learning in the small hours to braid her hair the way someone who has loved a child for more than a few weeks braids hair. He learned to ask her small questions about her drawings and to accept when her answers were monosyllabic. He learned that presence was not a single dramatic act, but 1,000 tiny repetitions. The first formal hearing was set as an emergency matter. A judge would consider immediate custody and the issuance of protective orders. Henrique wanted a judge who would understand evidence without being swayed by spectacle. He filed deliberately, aiming at a bench that had handled sensitive family matters before. They entered the courthouse with a restraint that felt like armor. Rafael, with Sofia's small hand in his, Jorge carrying a folder of sealed digital copies, Henrique with his legal briefcases, and Dr. Patricia and Dr. Renata with their professional statements. The courthouse waiting room buzzed with a different kind of hum. Camera drones and TV vans clustered in the lot, but inside they were blocked from the hearing room. Henrique had secured privacy for the child's presence. A legal clerk led them into a private anteroom where Sofia could sit quietly while Henrique presented the petition. The hearing itself was short in duration but dense in consequence. Henrique spoke calmly, folding exhibits into a cohesive narrative: the child's clinical condition, the teacher's observations, the forensics indicating deletion and tampering, and sworn statements from staff suggesting a pattern of denial and intimidation. When the judge asked for response, Veronica's counsel rose and tried, in a controlled voice, to object to the immediacy of the measures. "We acknowledge concern," he said, "but these are allegations. We ask the court to consider the presumption of normalcy until a fuller inquiry takes place." He spoke the language of courts, where form mattered as much as fact. Henrique countered with precision. He showed the judge the pediatric chart, the psychologist's written observations, Juliana's dated notes showing weight loss and behavior changes, and the keycard logs that placed staff in the pantry at suspicious hours. Then, finally, Henrique rested a sealed envelope on the table. "Your Honor," he said, "we also have a fragment of security footage that is partially corrupted, but contains corroborating metadata and a still frame that, because of the chain of custody we established, should be considered in the context of the other evidence." The judge unsealed the envelope in the privacy of the bench, reviewed the exhibits, and then, after a quiet pause that felt like it stretched into every waiting second, issued a ruling granting emergency protective custody to Rafael. The court ordered Veronica temporarily barred from the home and established supervised visitation conditions if any visitation was to occur. The judge also ordered that the police and the office of the prosecutor open a formal investigation into possible criminal neglect. It was not a declaration of guilt. It was an acknowledgement that the assembled evidence raised enough concern to prioritize the child's safety. In the hallway after the hearing, cameras strained toward them, but Henrique had arranged the logistics to keep Sofia shielded. A single photograph was permitted for the press pool. Rafael holding Sofia, looking tired but steady. The image became instantaneous shorthand. "Father reclaimed." Veronica's response was swift and theatrical. Her PR team framed the court's order as a temporary measure and pivoted to outrage, suggesting, without offering proof, that Rafael was using the child's crisis as a strategic move to seize control. Paid op-eds questioned the speed of the judge's order and suggested authoritatively that there were complex dynamics behind the scenes. Henrique had anticipated this. He had also prepared for the more dangerous tactic: buying silence. That tactic manifested in the faintest of ways: an offer to the housekeeper, a check slipped to a driver's niece, an after-the-fact bonus to a long-serving gardener. Those who had been close to the household's rhythms received gestures designed to cloud their willingness to testify. But Rafael, who had at his disposal both wealth and a new kind of impatience, pledged not to allow bribery to shape truth. Jorge, with a kind of stubborn dignity, told the staff they would be protected. "You will give testimony if it is needed," he said. "We will make sure you are safe." One of the few who agreed to speak was the housekeeper who had authored the little letter found in the notebook. She came to court trembling but resolute. In a soft voice, she recounted the small punishments: doors shut for hours, food withheld as discipline, admonitions that would make a child shrink inside herself. Her testimony was specific without being lurid. She spoke of a time she'd been told to take away Sophia's snack because we are teaching her not to beg, and of being paid later in a way that felt like hush money. Her hands shook as she described hiding the note in a student's notebook for fear of keeping it at home. Juliana testified next, her voice steady. She described Sophia's withdrawal, the drawings that shifted over time from open, cheerful houses to houses with windows shaded in black. She brought the stack of artwork, the court clerk displayed them, and the judge inspected the sequence like a slow revelation. Dr. Renata and Dr. Beatrice provided expert testimony about the signs of chronic neglect, not only the physical signs, but the behavioral patterns that indicated an environment where a child had been taught to be small. The forensics expert was the hinge. Hired from a reputable lab, she walked the court through the process of imaging the drives, explaining the metadata and how deletion logs provided a trail. She was careful with language, explaining how overwritten files could sometimes be partially recovered. And then, because the court had been patient and had allowed a forensic demonstration, she played a short clip. The room leaned forward, because in those seconds the story collapsed into the evidence. The clip was short, grainy, and incomplete. A still frame of a small figure at a pantry door, a hand guiding the child, and in the background, a voice. The audio was faint and had been enhanced in a legally documented chain of custody. It contained a line that, once cleared and transcribed by the lab, read in essence, "If you make trouble, you won't stay here." The statement was not explicit in method, but was explicit in intent. It matched the child's whispered words and the psychologist's notes about threats of abandonment. Veronica's counsel tried to cast doubt on the audio's authenticity. He questioned the chain of custody and suggested technological error. Enrique anticipated the line of attack and brought forward the assistant who had been recorded in the logs. Under oath, she admitted that she had been instructed to clean up the server and that she had been asked to follow orders by a manager who had authority over her. Her testimony was hesitant but consistent. She had been put in a position where fear dictated compliance. Ricardo, Veronica's ex-husband, arrived as a surprise witness. He had avoided the spotlight initially, but had been contacted by Enrique's team after Jorge's search turned up old complaints. In a recorded deposition, he described controlling behavior in their previous marriage, patterns of isolation, and punitive measures that had led to a separation. He did not accuse Veronica directly of the acts now alleged against her, but his testimony framed a pattern that the court found relevant. The idea was not to convict by association, but to demonstrate that similar behaviors had been described before. In the courtroom, the mosaic became coherent. The judge, careful, deliberate, noted the convergence. Medical evidence, teacher reports, forensics, staff testimony, and the fragmentary footage. Given the totality of the circumstances, the judge said when delivering a written order, the court finds sufficient basis to grant temporary protective custody and to refer the matter to the appropriate investigative authorities. The words were not a conviction. They were an institutional recognition that a child needed safeguarding while further legal processes unfolded. Veronica was stripped of unsupervised access. She filed motions, as expected, and her lawyers used every procedural avenue available. The ensuing days were a parade of motions and counters, of legal filings that moved like chess pieces across Enrique's desk. Enrique counseled patience. "We will let the discovery do the talking," he told Rafael. "Bills of particulars, depositions. This is where facts matter." Meanwhile, the prosecutor assigned to the case opened an inquiry into criminal neglect. Detectives interviewed staff, and a longer forensic audit of the company accounts and private transactions was undertaken. Evidence of suspicious payments to staff members, gifts and bonuses timed inconveniently, were flagged. The prosecutor requested bank records and made a formal recommendation for further investigation. At the story's edge, public opinion recoiled and reanimated in turns, but the legal process had its own tempo, and it was not prone to spectacle. As the machinery of law turned, Rafael turned a different machinery, the slow, patient work of repair. Sophia's days began to stitch together predictability. Mornings had toast and a stable routine. Afternoons had time at a small, carefully chosen school, where Juliana and other teachers were briefed on trauma-informed care. Evenings had stories read in an uneven but earnest cadence. Dr. Renata designed a therapeutic plan that included play therapy, art sessions, and gradual exposure to social situations. She explained to Rafael that healing would be non-linear. There would be regressions and progress, and his primary role was to be steady, to be present, to be physically and emotionally available. The rituals Rafael instituted were simple but profound. A breakfast at the same time every morning, a bedtime story that never varied in its little jokes, and a weekend ritual of a small walk to the garden where Sophia could watch the koi and feed them, a task he let her practice so she would feel useful and in control. He scheduled his calendar to minimize travel, delegating authority to colleagues. It cost him in deals and meetings, but in those losses he found a new kind of currency, reclaimed time. Sophia's healing appeared in increments. The first time she ate a whole piece of toast without stopping to hide a bit for later, Rafael felt like someone who had found a small, trembling victory. The first night she slept through without waking, he walked the house with a ridiculous, grateful lightness, as if he had cleared a bank's worth of debt. She began to draw doors open, suns smiling, and stick figures close together. She stopped hiding food in her sleeves. Each small variability in appetite and sleep became a report card on trust. There were hard days. A parade of court documents and depositions would sometimes reawaken fear in Sophia. A truck outside the house would be enough to send her to Rafael's lap. On those days, he learned not to be impatient with pain. He learned to name feelings aloud for her. That truck made you jump, it scared you, it's okay, and to validate emotion without trying to fix it immediately. He learned that sometimes the most effective action was to sit with discomfort until the child felt contained within his presence. One of the more painful chapters unfolded in a deposition where Veronica, under pressure, staged a narrative detached from the physical evidence. She accused Rafael of neglect, of hiring people to manipulate truth, and of using his wealth to create a spectacle. The defense accused the staff of perjury, the forensics team of overreach, and Henrique's team of a witch hunt. The courtroom tugged at trust in public ways, showing how the apparatus of power could be used to blur lines. Henrique responded by filing motions to compel evidence, and by calling expert witnesses who methodically explained the recovery processes, the metadata, and the forensic authenticity of the materials they had found. One piece of evidence that proved decisive in changing public tone was a text message thread recovered from a device. It was not salacious. It was ordinary. A staff assistant asking whether the child had been given her snack, and a reply that suggested a directive to withhold due to training. It was a tiny digital artifact, but when placed against the larger mosaic of testimony and medical findings, it read like corroboration of an intent to control nourishment as discipline. In the court of public opinion, people are moved by patterns more than by singular acts. The text was another tile in the floor. When the prosecutor announced that they intended to file charges of neglect and endangerment, the public felt a sharp pivot. The matter was no longer merely a custody dispute, but a criminal inquiry. Enrique cautioned that charges were the beginning of another long legal road where the presumption of innocence would be invoked and tested. Rafael felt relief that the system had recognized the need for accountability, but he also felt no triumph. He knew consequences could only be a partial salve for the damage done. Veronica's fall was not instantaneous, nor was it total. The networks and foundations that had previously embraced her issued careful statements about due process, and some donors distanced themselves quietly rather than publicly. The optics changed, and with it her access to platforms. Internally, her world narrowed into legal strategy rooms. Externally, she appeared increasingly alone in carefully staged images. The facade of philanthropy had shown cracks that would be difficult to mend. Inside the home, Rafael took another step. He convened a meeting with his philanthropic advisors and announced the formation of a small foundation dedicated to child protection. He did so not as spectacle, but as method. The foundation's first mandate was practical: fund trauma-informed training for teachers in private schools, create a small emergency fund for families to prevent children from being used as leverage, and establish a confidential hotline for domestic staff to report concerns without risking dismissal. Enrique raised an eyebrow. "There's a risk you'll be accused of buying reputation," he said. Rafael accepted that risk. "But we have means," he replied, "and if we can prevent even one child from being taught not to take up space, that's worth it." The foundation's first meeting was modest. Rafael hired a director experienced in child welfare and allocated seed funds. He insisted on an independent advisory board. He wanted the work to be more than philanthropy as publicity. He wanted systems that could survive scrutiny and not be dependent on a single personality. He learned in the process to think of legacy as duty rather than image. Therapy for Sofia unfolded in its own rhythm. Dr. Renata used play therapy to allow Sofia to reclaim narrative agency. In one session, Sofia constructed a small house out of blocks and placed a figure at the center. She named it Papa. Later, in a breakthrough that came as both a whisper and a relief, Sofia told Rafael, "When you're here, I am not afraid of leaving." The sentence was small and jagged, but it contained an unbidden miracle, a child's tentative trust. Rafael's rebuilding was not merely about rituals. It was about recalibrating priorities. He sold an interest in a satellite venture that would have required months of travel, and he invested time in learning the basic rhythms of school drop-offs and parent-teacher meetings. He stumbled sometimes, arriving at a pickup in a sweater and tie, still with the residue of a meeting on his face. But he came. He found that being held accountable by a small person was, in many ways, the most clarifying business he had ever entered. Months moved forward, and the legal processes did as well. Depositions produced admissions and denials, investigators sifted through accounts and emails, and the prosecutor prepared the case. The most damning material, the combination of medical findings, witness testimony, and digital artifacts, had already pushed the court to prioritize Sofia's safety. The criminal process would take its time, and Enrique warned that trials change people in ways that are sometimes irreversible. Rafael accepted the uncertainty. He had, he told himself, chosen the path that kept his daughter safe. The rest would be a matter for law. As the immediate legal storm settled into a series of scheduled motions, Rafael found space to plan for a different kind of publicness, one that centered prevention rather than repair. The Foundation's pilot program began at 3 private schools and 2 community centers. Teachers participated in training sessions designed to help them recognize signs not only of overt abuse, but of the quieter forms of neglect, patterns of withholding, sudden changes in appetite or weight, and the drawing behaviors that Juliana had noticed. The material was practical and humane, avoiding alarmism and emphasizing support. At a quiet launch event for the program, Rafael, rarely comfortable at podiums, spoke briefly. He did not recount the specifics of the case. He spoke instead about presence, about what it means to be held and to hold in return. "I learned," he said, "that protection is not a transaction. It is a commitment to showing up." The room stayed intent. The program began to gather support. Parallel to these public steps were private ones. Rafael and Sofia began to plant routines that would last beyond the headline cycles. They built a ritual of Saturday mornings where they would cook pancakes together. With Sofia in a small apron, she declared essential to making them perfect. He taught her to ride a bicycle with training wheels in the private lane. He sat with her while she painted and reframed the images she drew. He apologized on the occasions he needed to for being late, for not understanding, and for the ways his life had put them in harm's way. The diminution of fear in Sofia's face became a small, accumulative victory. One afternoon in the garden, she took an orange, peeled it with small fingers, and offered half to Rafael with a solemn generosity. "For you," she said. He took the piece, and in an instinct that had nothing to do with wealth or power, and everything to do with love, knelt to meet her at eye level. He felt, at that minute, as if some of the ledger books of his life had been cleared. There were moments of pain, too. Veronica's legal team continued to press claims, and at times sought to paint Rafael's involvement as opportunistic. The defense filed motions to challenge expert testimony and sought to exclude certain exhibits. In one painful hearing, witnesses who had once been loyal to the household recanted earlier statements under pressure from threats and inducements. The legal world showed its capacity for cruelty and its weakness in the face of money and fear. Enrique marshaled counter-evidence and called for protective measures for witnesses. The court, mindful of coercion, established guidelines to protect those who testified. The case's criminal dimension eventually moved to a point where the prosecutor filed formal charges of neglect and endangerment. The filing did not pronounce guilt. It alleged conduct consistent with criminal neglect and invited a trial to evaluate those allegations under the full weight of the law. The filing itself sparked a reaction from the networks and set off another round of public scrutiny. But for Rafael, the filing represented the system doing what he had hoped it would, treating the matter seriously, setting up the processes that could determine accountability. The weeks leading up to any trial felt like a distant mountain. For Rafael and Sofia, life was more focused on the immediate tender work. There were days when Sofia would conjure up a small storm of anger, a tantrum triggered by a triviality, and the household would have to attend to it with patience. These moments reminded Rafael how ingrained fear and control can be. They also showed how resilience can be built slowly, through predictability, through being held, and through the permission to cry. Eventually, in a small private ceremony, Rafael took another public step. He established a scholarship in Sofia's name to support children who had experienced neglect. It was both symbolic and practical, aimed at funding counselors in schools and enabling children to access free therapeutic services. He insisted on independent governance and on transparent audits to avoid the appearance of vanity. The gesture was careful, deliberate, and steeped in the humility he had learned. The legal case would continue its course, with motions and the slow churn of discovery, but the immediate arc of crisis had moved into an arc of repair. Sofia began to sleep through nights more consistently. She laughed more easily. She took part in a small play at school and recited a line with a shy but confident voice. Rafael watched from the audience, heart unthrottled, and felt a grief for the months lost that softened into gratitude for the months found. In time, the house itself took on new meanings. Rooms that had once been stages for polished photographs became lived spaces. The library, where Rafael had once slept in an absence of pause, now had a low lamp and a stack of children's books. The service yard, where he had first found her, was now equipped with a small bench and a basket for leftover fruit that was distributed to staff and neighbors, an act symbolic of something larger, a refusal to let the sight of a child's humiliation remain a place defined only by shame. There was an ongoing tension between the desire for retribution and the need for restoration. Rafael knew that not all wrongs could be fully erased by accountability. The court could adjudicate consequences, but the deeper work was practical and patient. He invested in therapy not only for Sophia, but for staff who had been traumatized by participating in a household where moral compromises were rusty and common. He ensured that the Foundation's programs included training for domestic staff to recognize exploitation, and that it provided avenues for anonymous reporting to protect livelihoods as well as children. In quieter moments, Rafael would sometimes sit with Sophia and ask about the future in small, practical ways. "Do you want us to get a dog?" he would ask, half teasing, half testing. Sophia considered the idea, then nodded solemnly. They went to look at puppies together, and, though the timing for another creature's dependency required care, the act was part of growing trust that they could consider bringing a new life into their home. The public arc altered slowly as well. Some donors retracted support from organizations that had once associated themselves with Veronica. Others asked for independent audits and governance reforms to prevent similar abuses of virtue. The news cycle moved on, as it always does, but the Foundation's quiet work continued, and Juliana's training program began to ripple into other schools as colleagues shared best practices. One evening, months after the initial discovery, Rafael took Sophia to a small park beyond the private walls of the estate. They sat on a bench in the late light and watched other children run in the open. Sophia pointed to a willow and said, with a gravity that surprised him, "We should plant a tree." He smiled and promised they would. The act of planting a tree, an emblem of hope and patience, felt right. A living thing that would grow slowly, heedless of headlines, anchored in the soil. They planted it together some weeks later, with a handful of neighbors and a teacher from school. Sophia placed the first handful of earth, laughing when it crumbled through her small fingers. Rafael stood with the spade in his hand and felt that the public storms could rage outside their little world, and still here, life could be made to grow again. The Foundation's logo, a small, simple design of an open door, was pinned to the flowerbed as a modest plaque. It was not a monument, it was a marker of intention. The prosecution's case would, in time, be heard in a more extensive setting with witnesses called and defenses mounted. That was a future hinge the present had for Rafael and Sophia shifted. He had learned to reconfigure ambition in light of responsibility. He had found that presence was an investment with the highest return he had ever known. On the nights when Sophia woke with a dream and found him at her bedside, she would press her face against his shirt and murmur, "I stayed." He would reply without flourish, "Yes, you stayed." The phrase was a promise and a release. It was the quiet undoing of the word that had once terrified her, that she could be sent back, and the building of a new language in which she knew she belonged. In years to come, the case would be cited in policy debates about child protection, about the necessity of anonymous reporting channels for domestic staff, and about the need for teachers to have the tools to spot the subtler forms of neglect. The foundation Rafael started would fund research and pilot protective pathways in several schools. It would not erase the past, but it would make possible interventions for other children. Veronica's legal fate would be decided by a court after thorough procedures. The story of the courtroom would be separate from the private work of care at the Mendes house. Rafael never sought to weaponize consequences for the sake of retribution. He sought them as a matter of justice and deterrence. The law would determine culpability, the family would determine care. On a quiet night, After a day of therapy and a long walk, Rafael tucked Sophia into bed and read a story about a small bird who learned to trust the sky. She laughed at the bird's awkward flaps and then grew still, eyes heavy. "Will you stay tonight?" she whispered. He kissed her forehead. "I will stay," he said. "I will always stay." As years moved, the rituals of presence became less exceptional and more ordinary. Rafael's calendar contained fewer flights and more parent-teacher meetings. The foundation grew slowly and steadily, and its programs learned to speak plainly to the practical needs of teachers and families. Sophia grew into a child who took up space in ways both small and daring. She picked out her own clothes. She arranged flowers in a vase on the kitchen table. She asked questions that pulled her father into honest answers. Once, holding her little hand as they walked to school, Rafael glanced at the news crawl of an evening broadcast that briefly mentioned the ongoing legal matter in a paragraph of a story. He felt a residual twinge, but also a steadier sensation. The knowledge that the life he had now chosen to lead had an orientation he could not unwind. He had been tested by a single, shocking discovery: a child in a trash bin. The reason he discovered, the concealment, the calculated small cruelties, had required legal reckoning and moral accountability. But the discovery had also forced a reorientation of his life, away from absence and toward the hard, imperfect work of being present. He had been a man who measured risk in spreadsheets. He became, increasingly, a man who measured his days by being a parent. The two sets of accounts did not always reconcile, but they had begun to speak to each other in the language of responsibility. On a cool spring afternoon, Rafael and Sophia stood at the small park where they had planted the tree. The sapling had put out a few bright leaves. Sophia placed a small ribbon on the trunk, and Rafael knelt beside her to tie it. She looked at him with a clear, steady gaze and, with the solemnity of a child who knows the gravity of promises, said, "We are not leaving." "No," Rafael said, and he meant it with the full measure of what he had learned. He had found in the worst of a single day a reason to remap his life. He had discovered, painfully and finally, that wealth without presence is a brittle thing. The house and the documents and the philanthropic gestures were useful, but the central truth that remained was plain and human. The work of protecting a child is ongoing, tedious, and sacred. They walked home hand in hand. The sun slanted low. In the kitchen, a small plate of oranges awaited them on the counter, peeled and arranged by a considerate staff member who had been part of their slow, collective repair. Inside Sophia's sketchbook, a new drawing lay open, a house with a wide door and a huge sun that smiled without worry. Rafael looked at the image and felt a quiet, deep gratitude that was not a substitute for guilt, but a companion to it. The discovery in the trash had been the hinge of change. The why, deliberate cruelty and a culture of silencing had been exposed by methodical, careful work. What followed was repair, accountability, and a slow rebuilding that had already begun to outlast headlines. If anything of the experience remained as a lesson, it was this: protection is not a transaction, nor is it a stunt. It is, in its simplest form, the daily, sometimes invisible practice of keeping promises. Rafael had made such a promise in a white chair in a hospital corridor, and day by day he was living up to it. Thank you for staying with this story. If it moved you, please subscribe for more narratives that lift up the importance of protecting children, and consider sharing this video to raise awareness. If you're able, please also support local child protection organizations or hotlines in your area. Small acts can make a vital difference.